here in a dream. I'm just stuck here in a dream.
Welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Guns and Yoga podcast. My name is Wendy Hummel. We all know sleep is important and that most cops and first responders don't get enough. It's pretty much a given that you will sacrifice sleep in this line of work, whether it be shift work, overtime, or call-outs. Today's guest, Dr. Stephen James, is a sleep researcher with the University of Washington whose research shows that well-rested cops make good decisions, have better job performance, and improved community relations. Dr. James is passionate about helping cops and other frontline workers sleep well, not just so that they can perform better at work, but so they can live a better life. Our conversation demonstrates the importance of working with researchers to implement evidence-based practices. I think you'll really enjoy this episode. We talk ideal shift length, his thoughts on rotating shifts, intermittent fasting, tactical napping, cops as functional athletes, and why incorporating exercise into your shift is so important. And one of my favorite topics, yoga. Dr. James and his wife have created sleep hygiene training, and he discusses some of his suggestions to set you up for a successful night's sleep, regardless of what shift you work. And finally, Dr. James tells us to say yes, and that it is far better to regret something you say yes to rather than something that you say no to. All right, welcome to today's show. Today, I'm very happy to have Dr. Stephen James. Dr. Stephen James has a Ph.D. in criminal justice with a focus in police performance. He is a researcher and is currently working at the College of Nursing at Washington State University. He's got a pretty extensive background, which includes 23 years in the British military as an Irish Ranger. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today to discuss the research that you do on police performance and sleep and how that can impact someone on the job and just for long-term performance. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. And long-term health as well. It's all wrapped up in the same thing. So my lab at Washington State University is part of a much bigger research center that looks at sleep and performance from mathematical modeling through animal models. So we have fly labs, rats, mice, cats, ferret labs, humans, and then humans in the field. Where my group specializes is looking at occupations such as law enforcement, the military, elite athletes, nurses, anyone who has an element of sleep deprivation, shift work, and the consequence of getting it wrong is high, either to the individual or those they care for or serve.
Sure. And just to back up a little bit, how did you become interested in police performance? I know you do a few other things, but when you were deciding what to study, and how did that all come about?
This is going to sound really strange to your listeners, but I didn't. My wife decided for me,
Wow.
which is pretty much the run of the mill for our marriage. I was over in Afghanistan with the army, and she came to America. If you can tell from my accent, I'm not a local. She came to America to study her master's degree in criminal justice. She wanted to be her undergrad is in psychology. She wanted to go into forensic psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And she met a professor, Brian Vila, who arguably started the science of police fatigue. He's a retired cop, a retired police chief. He was the first police chief of Micronesia for the U.S. Back in the day. And don't judge him for this, but he was also a Fed for a while. He worked at NIJ as the director of crime control as a GS-15, and then came to Washington State University. He was sort of headhunted by the wider sleep and performance research group to kind of build out this area of police performance and fatigue, military occupational fatigue, and so on. And he recognized my wife's talent very early on and said, "Hey, you need to stay and do your Ph.D. I'll pay for it," or his lab will, his grants will pay for it. And my wife turned around and said, "Well, that's great, but I haven't seen my husband in almost a year, and it will be more than a year by the time I do get to see him." And he started emailing me while I was in Afghanistan and said, "Hey, I'm going to keep your wife. I've got a job for you." And I had no interest in graduate school. I had no interest in further education. To go back a few years, I joined the Army at 17. I didn't even graduate high school. So I did 10 years enlisted before I became an officer, and I did my undergrad to become an officer, not because I liked school. So thinking about doing a master's or a PhD was the furthest thing from my mind, but Brian convinced me. I came across in 2008, the very end. I was November 2008, just to do my master's, and then that rolled into my PhD. And then when Brian retired in 2015, I took over the lab from him. I kind of inherited the lab and his research agenda and so on.
That's a really fascinating path, because typically people, when they decide they're going to go to get a master's or further education, it's something that they've planned. So I guess when you get an email from a random stranger in another country that says, "I'm not letting your wife come back," that's a good motivation.
It is, and the wife is Lois, is the brains of the operation. We work very closely together. Our research interests intertwine. So about 70% of the work I do is with Lois, and about 30% we work independently, and that is good to stay married,
Sure.
to not always be in each other's pockets. But yeah, it's been great, and my advice to anyone is, especially my friends' children who are thinking about joining the military and whatever, they normally get sent my way and like, what's your advice? And my advice is just say yes. Whenever a door opens, just say yes. You never know where it's, I'd rather regret the stuff I did than the stuff I didn't do. And I certainly don't regret coming and working with Brian and following this path, because being an infantry guy, it's tough on the body, and my body was more ready for a transition than my heart was, but I made it now.
Yeah, and you got that experience to draw upon when you're doing your
Yes,
research.
yes. A lot of our funding comes from the Department of Defense, about 80% out of the Office of Naval Research, looking at warfighter performance and understanding how stress and fatigue affects decision making for the military. And then about 15% from the Department of Justice. We currently have two reasonably sized grants from DOJ through the National Institute of Justice, and one is specifically looking at how shift work and fatigue affects police performance. And our partners in that study is Seattle PD, and the other study is looking at whether or not implicit bias training has an effect on behavior for street cops. Does it, putting them through bias training, does it make a difference? And our partners on that study is Sacramento PD. So we'll work with anyone who wants to understand how stress, fatigue, training impacts their performance. Then we're more than happy to partner with them. And we absolutely need partner agency, because we can't do this type of research to try and make it safer for officers on the street without agencies sort of stepping up and saying, yeah, we'll get on board with that.
Right. And I remember that when we spoke last time, you were telling me about your work with Seattle PD. And are you able to go into a little bit more detail about what
Yeah,
that looks
absolutely.
like and what the implications are from that research?
It's an NIJ funded study, which what we call a randomized control trial. So individuals will opt in to the study, and then they'll get randomly assigned to either a treatment or a control group. And the treatment in this case is fatigue training. We've developed 8 modules, very short, between 6 minutes and 15. There's 1 or 2 that are 6-7 minutes long training videos, and with a little bit of homework after each one, kind of journaling and logging and reflecting. The longest being 15 minutes once a week. And we want to see if this training intervention improves sleep and other measures of quality of life. So prior to taking the training, officers participated in a rather extensive sleep, health, stress, behavioral health questionnaire, and other satisfaction with the job related questions too. And we tracked their sleep using wrist actigraphy. It looks a little like a Fitbit, but it's a research grade device that accurately tracks their sleep for 2 weeks prior to the intervention, prior to the training, and then they either randomly get assigned to no training or the training group They go through that for 8 weeks, and then they wear the device again to see, did that 8-week training change the quality and quantity of sleep? And again, that battery of questionnaires to say, did it improve sleep, alertness? And we're right now collecting the post-intervention data, so I can't sort of report on that. But in similar studies that we've done, for example, with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Ottawa Police Service, we found that this type of training improves not just sleep and feeling alert and performance in the job, but reduces how we experience pain. It reduces family dysfunction and even increases satisfaction with sex life and so on. So there's a huge amount of benefit from sort of looking after your sleep and protecting it. It's a core biological function that we really cannot do without.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And probably the number one issue I think that's facing law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of important issues, but I think that you can agree, you know a lot more about this than I do. The number one thing that people will all probably agree on, if you have a group of 20 or 25 cops or corrections officers in a room, that nobody can get 8 hours of sleep. Whether it be uninterrupted or being able to fall asleep, it seems like that's not the norm.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it's a win-win if we really address the sleep and stress that officers or corrections officers are under. And you'll hear, we work in the area of bias too, and we work in the area of police performance and so on. But 99.99 times, or percent of the time, I should say, when we have a well-rested, non-stressed police officer, they do a good job. They make the right decision. They make the moral decision. And when we see these tragedies that unfold, it's quite often officers have too much fatigue, too much stress, too much other going on in their life, and they weren't acting within the realms that they would normally work in. So although we do develop and deliver bias training, I quite honestly say that some of the best bias training we could offer is sleep and health, stress management, because when we have well-rested cops, they make the good choices. And so improving police community relations is also tied up in improving officers' sleep and wellness, right? Because when you have these tired, stressed cops, they're grumpy, there's friction in, when they interact. So we hear these calls for defunding the police and so on. And I'm an adamant advocate against defunding the police, because if we think that giving agencies less resources will result in better work, that's a fantasy. We need to support our police officers. We need to make sure that they are staffed correctly, so agencies are not relying on overtime and burning the candle at both ends. And it was scary working with agencies across the nation, knowing the levels of overtime agencies were running month to month before the troubles of the summer, before all of the unrest, and then putting officers under that amount of stress, extra work, and so on. I was just waiting for the next tragedy to happen, because cops are human and humans have limits.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you just said. So kind of on the same line with that conversation, what do you recommend? I mean, because obviously not just, this is a common problem throughout the country and probably internationally that we're facing, in that we can't hire enough people and we can't retain enough people to do the job. And as much as we want to not make people work overtime, a lot of times we don't have a choice. So what do you recommend in terms of your research or policy recommendations, things like that? Is there anything that has come up in that arena?
I think there's two things that we need to really consider, especially if you're in a leadership position or have oversight of police budgets. And that is a risk management model. What level of risk are you willing to accept? We don't allow any city employee to come to work or county employee to come to work drunk, but we'll accept them coming to work with inadequate sleep. And in many cases, the effects are similar. They're still impaired. And so we really need to understand, and that's sort of where my lab fits in. We're trying to understand what those limits are. And the sort of the underpinning of what I try and do is we absolutely should hold any government employee, regardless of if they're working at the DMV or law enforcement or wherever, they are public servants, and as the public, we should be able to hold them accountable. But at the same time, if we're holding someone accountable, that level of performance has to be achievable by a human given the stresses they're under. And if we're holding them to a standard that's not possible, that's not ethical. So trying to understand where the risks are, where the levels of performance are, and then each municipality needs to understand, well, do we care enough about this to invest in it, right? Because if we want to reduce accidents, errors, injuries, if we want to improve community relations, we need to invest in it. And that's the trade-off that needs to happen, is that you can't have good police without solid investment into public safety. At the same time, agencies, jurisdictions need to do what we would describe as true cost accounting to really understand how much fatigue is costing them right now. It's not just time and a half or double time for the overtime. It's the increased risk of accident, illness. It's the damage it's doing to community relations. We know that successive shifts, and especially night shifts that are interrupted with training in court, will lead to more citizen complaints, those types of things. It will lead to more accidents and injuries, vehicle accidents, and litigation. And quite often these costs are from different pots of money, and not everyone has visibility. There'll be the cities will be mutually insured, so they're paying into this insurance fund for litigation or collisions or so on. City fleet maintenance is paying for the dings and dents of minor collisions. So no one sees all the costs. And that's one area that we really need to work in, is understanding the economics of fatigue to make the business case that getting more boots on the ground is beneficial, and it's actually a cost-saving measure. That is on top of how it's going to keep our men and women who serve our communities healthy, not just during the job, but into their retirement. Law enforcement die. The number keeps changing in a scary way. When I first started doing this, John Violanti is one of the I don't know if you know John. He's a good friend and colleague out of SUNY Buffalo. He's a retired New York State officer himself, and he works closely with the CDC, looking at mortality and morbidity of law enforcement. And 10 years ago, the number was 7 years after retirement, earlier than other municipal workers. And now it's creeping up to 10 years younger than other municipal workers after retirement. Due to chronic illness, due to suicide and health risks associated with PTSD, increased drinking and so on. So I honestly believe, hand on heart, that if the women and men out there are giving the best years of their lives to their communities, that they should be able to retire in good enough physical and mental health to enjoy whatever comes next.
Yeah, and you touched upon about 4 or 5 different really important points there. So first of all, just your angle. So I tried to take notes so I wouldn't forget to ask you all these things. But first of all, just coming at it from that risk management viewpoint, I think that's very beneficial. So have you had success working with law enforcement agencies in them taking all this great advice that you're giving them based off of your research?
Yes, some agencies will double up police officers on graveyard shift to share the driving. For example, we all know distracted driving is bad, but apparently if you've got a badge, it's not so bad, because I've literally been in a police vehicle when the officer was typing with both hands on the MDT while driving, not at excessive speeds, but 40 and a 30 kind of thing. So now you add fatigue to the mix. That's all. Don't get me started. I work with the National Police Foundation in trying to reduce officer-involved collisions and struck-by instances too. So that, as we know, motor vehicle collisions are the number one on-duty cause of death. fatigue plays a significant role there, and especially how it interacts with distraction. So if you could take that distraction load away from your graveyard power shift officers, that's one. There are some agencies that do it systematically, like California Highway Patrol. Their graveyard shifts are predominantly two-person vehicles. I've had some agencies I've worked with that have either eliminated overtime for graveyard shift officers because they're the most impacted by fatigue, because trying to work at night and sleep during the day is counter to our biology. And I could talk for an hour on why that is and so on. But so, some have taken the advice that if you do need to hold graveyard shift officers over for training, bring them in early. Don't hold them over at the end of their shift. Bring them in a couple of hours early for training. My wife and I are both board members, advisory board members to the risk management company Lexipol. I don't know if you're familiar with Lexipol. They
Yes.
write model policies and so on. So we've been trying to, in that regard, kind of help formulate policies, and they have some training endeavors too. And then right now we've been working for the last 3 years with CDC NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, to develop an online training for policers to reduce fatigue. And that, once it's validated, will be available free to any agency that wants to just log on. There's 2 modules or 2 tracks, one for the line officer and one for first line supervision, because kind of looking at some of the more nuanced areas of fatigue around supervision. One agency has a unwritten policy. I would rather see it in writing if possible, but any officer can self-identify as being too fatigued to drive that night, and they just get doubled up. And there's no paper written. There's nothing that goes in their jacket about it. It's just a safety measure that, I'm sure that if it happens shift after shift, their supervisor will be like, hey, it's on you too to come to work as rested as possible. But the moment it's just, okay, you can ride with so-and-so tonight, just to reduce that risk of collision. I have been trying to work with some state police departments, with some of their motor vehicle leads to develop fatigue training specifically around operating of motor vehicles and fatigue. Agencies that have long commutes, and trying to restrict the number of hours they can drive. They can be on duty and still drive a patrol vehicle. 2 things there. One, none of them have been implemented as such, and apart from one, and that one, it's the bare minimum, like the absolute bare minimum of what I would call safe or acceptable when it comes to the amount of hours. You can be awake for 16 and drive and have to have 8 hours off between shifts. Well, if you only have 8 hours off between shifts, you're probably getting a maximum of 7 hours of sleep. And that's if you're lucky. So, we would say that 8 hours between shifts is the absolute minimum that anyone should be able to work.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask you that. I know I've heard you say before that if somebody is up for, I think it's 24 hours, it's the equivalent of blowing a 0.10 as far as on the untoxilizer. So, and I know, just speaking from personal experience, I've been up when I've gotten called into work before as a detective 18, 19 hours in a row. Easy, if not more sometimes, which it is never any fun. But what do you recommend? And that sometimes that can't be helped, obviously, in those situations. But in your, ideally, what would be the maximum amount of numbers or the shift that you would recommend for those working patrol or a shift in a detention facility?
So the really unsatisfying answer that most sleep researchers will give you is that it depends, right? It depends on the risk associated with your job. And if you were working in Walmart at night restocking the shelves, you can work 12-hour nights, because I personally am okay with you mixing up the beans with the peas.
Sure.
That's not going to get anyone killed unless you have a severe pea allergy. But I don't believe that working in a detention center, working the street is a 70-80% job. And that's what happens is that, yes, you can do the job, but you're not doing it safely. You're not doing it to the maximum that performance that you can. And that's one of the reasons we work with athletes, right? We don't make them better athletes. We just allow them to access their own potential by taking sleep seriously. But to talk about shift lengths, it depends on how busy your jurisdiction is, how much driving you have to do, what sort of commutes you have to and from the job. As a general rule of thumb, we like 10-hour shifts. And the reason being, we know from about 110 years of industrial medicine that the risk of accident, illness, and injury increase exponentially after hour 9. So the 10th hour is still dangerous, but 11 and 12, and if you push it even further, it gets much, much worse. 10 hours also gives you enough time between shifts, even if you are working graves and you're circadianly disrupted, as in, you're trying to sleep off during the daytime when the body's not designed to sleep. That makes that a little easier. But the reason we don't say 8-hour shifts is because to do a 40-hour work week, you need to do 5 of them in a row. And the problem isn't just with how long you work a shift for, it's also the number of successive shifts. So the second shift is more dangerous than the first and the third. So working 10s, you can do a 4-10, 3 off a rotation and still get a 40-hour work week in. So that's kind of, I work with an agency that has a strange shift pattern. I've yet to find another one that does it. They work 10-hour, 40-minute shifts, and they work something like 5 on, 3 off, 4 on, 3. And it's some weird on-off rotation that adds up to being 160 hours over 4 weeks, as opposed to just a 40-hour work week. But again, those extra 40 minutes is pushing the envelope there on safety. And if you're already working at 12, if you're held over for overtime, you are really in that dangerous area for when it comes to fatigue. So 4-10s, and for any of your readers, there's a white paper that's just gone out from Lexipol that kind of lays out the argument that my wife contributed a small amount to, of why 10s are a good bet. I've worked the extreme. When I was a young soldier, I did a couple of tours in Yugoslavia, and you're old when you worked in countries that don't exist anymore. And when we first got there, for the first 3 months, we worked 36 on, 12 off.
Oh,
And
wow.
that wasn't a sleeping 36 shift. That was you were active for those, and that was dangerous. And they say that youth is wasted on the young. If I'd known back then what I knew now, I might have pushed back from that. But we all have a service mindset. If you're in the military, law enforcement, corrections, any type of first or emergency responder, it's very hard for us to say no. It's hard for us to say no to serving our communities. It's hard for us to say no to training because we want to get better. But we need to understand that there's limits. There's limits to what we can do safely, both in the short term and how it impacts our health and wellness long term by burning the candle at both ends.
So real quick, just kind of going back to what you were talking about on shift work, you mentioned a couple things. I'm curious what your thoughts are on rotating shifts, because there's a lot. I've never worked for an agency myself that has done this, but you alluded to it where they do maybe for, I don't know, a month or 2 months, 6 months, and then they rotate. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. And then also, if you wouldn't mind talking to us a little bit about, you mentioned Dr. John Violanti, and I know he does a lot of work with metabolic syndrome and the impacts of long-term health and inflammation and leading to disease on the type of work that we do. And I know you've done a lot of research on that as well, as far as how sleep and shift work impact, the potential for long-term disease. So if you could just cover those few things for us, that'd be appreciated.
What was the first thing you asked me to cover there?
See, I kind of asked you two
All
in
right.
one there. Sorry
Yeah.
about that. The first thing is I'm just curious about what your opinion is on rotating shifts.
Oh,
So
rotating shifts.
rotating
So
shifts, yeah.
yes, my first opinion is if it's a backward rotating shift, stop it right now. Like, so what I mean by a backward rotating is that you're going from a late shift to an early shift, right? You're
Okay.
going backwards. Forward rotating shifts and rapid forward rotating shifts where you do like 2 days on earlies, 2 days on mids, 2 days on graves
Mm-hmm.
with a significant period off. There is some evidence to say that that's okay. Now, that puts a lot of strain on people's domestic situations where there's no set schedule, and especially when it doesn't fit easily into a 7-day week, because unless your significant other is on board with it and you don't have kids or whatnot, where you have schools and all of these other, practices and so on to try and get your kids to, those rapid rotating shifts can be very difficult on families, being able to set a schedule. However, working 20 years a graveyard shift is not a good thing either, right? So that comes with its own cost. If you are going to be on a rotating shift, it should be rotating forward. So you should go from an early shift to a mid shift to a late shift.
Okay.
If there's more than two shifts, the idea of rotating shifts, if it's not going to be a rapid rotating 2 or 3 days in one shift, it needs to be 3 or more months. So a week on a shift, 2 weeks, a month on a shift really messes with people's ability to adjust. It takes about 3 months for the body to adjust to a shift. And we don't ever fully adjust to a graveyard shift because we are nocturnal animals, no matter what we try. But it's a good answer to spreading the pain. So you don't have officers who are stuck on graves until they have the seniority to get off of graves, right? And that, in some agencies, can be decades. I know one agency I've worked with where the junior guy on days had 15 years in. So for anyone to get off nights was, impossible if they were not, unless someone wanted to bid for nights. So if you're going to do a rotating schedule, 3 months minimum
Okay.
on one schedule. There's no really good answer. And, we can blame Edison because once Edison invented the electric light bulb, society became 24/7 and we have to police it, right? Public safety is a 24/7 gig, 365 days of the year. I would ask agencies to really consider what they're doing at those really wee hours of the morning, 2, 3, 4 a.m. I kind of joke that bad guys have circadian rhythms too, and if pattern of life in your jurisdiction allows it, reduce the number of officers you're exposing to potential collisions by pulling them into, cop shops or whatever you happen to have. So they're not driving around an empty city at 4 a.m. For no reason.
Do you know of
But
any? Oh, excuse me. I'm
go
sorry
ahead.
to
No.
interrupt you. I'm curious because you just made me think. Do you know of any agencies right now that have implemented something like that, where it makes me think of what firefighters do? They're just sitting at the station house waiting for the alarm, so that they're housed somewhere until they need to respond to something.
I know of a couple of agencies that have cop shops and even some that have on-duty napping, which is I am a huge fan of, right? Because you hear the argument, well, we can't nap on duty, the taxpayer will never satisfy it, but you just mentioned them, right? The firefighters, they're usually employed by the same city, the same county, but they get to sleep on duty. It's all about protecting performance, and trying to mitigate risk of accident or error. And if you want good policing, they have to be well rested. So I would be in favor of, for graveyard shift officers, to allow them to pull them in off the street, staggered. Obviously, you don't want to take everyone off the street at once, between 2 and 4, and put them through, a 30-minute nap rotation, so they just get that little boost of sleep. I don't know of any agency that's doing it systematically. We're actually talking with an agency in Arizona to maybe do a pilot test with them to actually show that it's efficacious. But to kind of quickly go back on that point of rotating shifts, there was a agency in Canada, Calgary, Ph.D., and I'm not sure. I need to touch base with them. I'm not sure if they've stuck with this model, but they implemented a really interesting model, which might be difficult in the U.S. because of different employment laws. But everyone got paid as if they were doing 4 10s, but days did 4 12s, the mid shift did 4 10s, and the graves did 4 8s. And they then rotated every 3 months. So you over the year you end up working, or the same amount as if you were just on 4 10s, but it was reducing the risk of those in the evening. Now that kind of gets into a problem with employment law in this country of getting paid for hours you haven't worked yet. But we need to start sort of thinking outside the box, because it's not just about boots on the ground. It's about how effective they are when they're there and how safe they are. In the Army, we do a great job of making sure our soldiers are well rested when they can, because we know that we have to work extreme hours when we have to. And my old platoon sergeant used to always say to me, "Boss, I'd rather be looking at them than looking for them." So he would bring them in to sleep whenever we had the opportunity to sleep. But we need to kind of have that mindset that it's not about just being present. It's about being function safe. And anything that we do from a policy wise or supervision wise should be there to support that officer's safety, whether or not it's short term, as in how they're going to not get involved in collisions or interactions with the public that could have been avoided, or long term in how it's affecting their health and wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We need some more creative solutions to some of these issues. And, a lot of times in policing, we hear a lot of, well, that's just the way we've always done it. And I just don't think that we can fall back on that anymore, because it clearly isn't working.
Right. And our city here in Spokane, Washington, a few years ago, not sure if it's still the case again, because, things change. We've got a new chief since then. But about 5 years ago, the city basically refused to respond to property crime calls because they were understaffed, underfunded. So the chief says, you can either have this type of policing or this, but with the resources you've given me, you can't have both. So they just, and it was funny, I had Anderson Cooper's news crew in my lab, with all of their broadcast quality cameras doing a piece. They've spent the whole day filming with us. They went back to their hotel, took the memory cards out of the cameras to edit, to send it up to CNN. They came out in the morning and all of their broadcast equipment had been stolen from their rental cars.
Oh, God.
About $20,000 worth of camera equipment and accessories. So they called 911. They were told to call Crime Check, and they'd be given a number for their insurance. So they came back to my lab, and I called a buddy of mine who was a sergeant at the time in major crime, saying, unless you want to be the news, just send someone. And they did. And from what I understand, I've never heard any different, but I don't believe they ever got their equipment back. So someone is making super high quality home videos.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
And
never leave a Pelican case in the back of a car. They're just too tempting.
That's funny. So, I know that a lot of agencies, including the ones that I work for, implement something similar. If there's a property crime and it's below us, depending on how much it's worth, they'll do a phone report or send it to somebody to take something over the phone and give you a case number. So, let me ask you this: when we're talking about these rotating shifts, something else came to mind that is of interest to me, because I'm personally trying to figure something out at the agency I work at. What are your thoughts on, or do you know of any agencies who have incorporated fitness, like fitness time or working out, as part of their shift?
Yep. Spam PD, for example, they have. But what I understand from talking to the rank and file, the boots on the ground, and you may have experienced this in your career, that it really depends on how the supervisor that they work for views that.
Oh,
And if the
yes.
supervisor is a gym rat, then their troops are allowed to hit the gym on company time. If the supervisor doesn't value that, then the troops are discouraged from doing it. So yeah, there are agencies that have it, and it's beneficial, right? I mean, we we are asking the men and women of law enforcement to basically be functional athletes in many cases. The vest, the duty belt, they weigh on you, and they're not as heavy as they used to be, and they're more comfortable than they used to be. But that amount of weight on your body for 12 hours a day or so, it weighs on you. And if we're going to ask people to do a job that is physically and mentally demanding, then allowing them to be in the best shape they can be in to achieve that. And I would argue that core fitness or core strength and things like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with yoga, but yoga is absolutely key for flexibility and making sure that, when you need that explosive power, you don't end up doing a hammy like all of us older people end up doing, thinking we're 20 again. So
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. I don't think I told you this about me, but I am a yoga and
I know
meditation
you,
teacher.
you did. That's why I threw.
Oh, okay,
I threw you a bone there.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if I told you that or not, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to be able to add that in to part of your shift, and I just don't know. I don't know the best way to do that. I don't know what the answer is, but somehow being able to incorporate like an hour or 30 minutes after your shift before you go home to be able to implement that fitness.
And I would even argue that roll call yoga, to get our mind in the right place is just as important, right? To have
Hmm.
that mindfulness. I would even argue that a small window prior to their shift starting and a small window at the end to allow them to shake off their shift, and as they're taking their vest off, they can also take off the stress and not bring that home, so they're not living with it. So um, funniest thing I ever saw, my best friend here is a yoga instructor too, and she when I was working with Spokane PD out of their training facility, they host a police academy once or twice a year. They're as part of the statewide police academy, and the DT instructors asked if my friend would come in and do yoga with the recruits, and the recruits were great, especially in the academy setting. They'll do whatever they're told, right? Because they have a
Sure.
vested interest. And the funniest thing was seeing the DT instructors joining in, and these muscle bound men and women who haven't done any functional stretching, unless there's a 200-pound in their hand. It was funny to see, and they said that was the hardest thing they'd done in some time. Even though they could bench a small car, just doing the yoga was quite beneficial for them.
Yeah, we hear that a lot when we teach it. Not to get too far off on this tangent of yoga, but when we teach it at where I work right now, you're right. The recruits, they don't have a choice. As a matter of fact, it's built into the academy curriculum in our academy. But when you get some of these other people who've been on for a while doing it, I think people have a preconceived notion that yoga is just stretching and relaxation, and in fact, depending on the type of yoga you do, it can be a very different experience. So I think people are often surprised.
And it's very good for sleep. I mean, a lot of officers who have sleep-related issues, yes, there's a very high prevalence, twice the prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea in police officers than there is in the general working public in America. But a lot of police sleep issues are centered around insomnia, and quite often it's due to not being able to switch off, right? And it's your sympathetic response, your fight or flight response is still activated when you're trying to rest and digest. And yoga, mindfulness, box breathing, whatever you can do to re-engage your parasympathetic will also help with your sleep. So it's kind of why I would also recommend it, not just at the beginning of shift, but but as an off switch for the end of the shift, so you can allow your body to get into a state that is more conducive to good quality sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you could come and teach a class, because that's exactly what I tell people. It's not only beneficial to decompress after, a certain call, but if you can't sleep at night, trying to do some of these things. So are there any other recommendations that you have for those who may be having trouble falling asleep? And I'm guessing this is part of the training that you and your wife have put together.
It is. And there's, we would describe the suite of measures that fall into two buckets. One is fatigue countermeasures, kind of the caffeine and the stuff that you try and do to stave off the negative effects of sleep deprivation. But the only real answer is sleep. And to get good sleep, you need to focus on what we would call sleep hygiene. So there's a number of things that you can do to make your environment as conducive as possible to good sleep. One is invest in light-proof blinds. If you are in a career in law enforcement or corrections, there is going to be shift work in your future or your past, but do invest in good quality light blocking, light-proof blinds and make your bedroom dark as possible. We would also advocate that you put in some very dim night lights that lead a path to your restroom and lead a path to your kitchen or wherever you get water from. So if you do wake in the night, you don't have to turn on a light that will then wake you up. So make sure you got enough light to aim, guys. So, but not light enough that it's going to wake you up. So dark, quiet. If I'm lucky enough that I live in a neighborhood where nothing ever happens. Sometimes hear some compression brakes of the trucks going down the hill behind, but a really quiet, we are the penultimate house in the city, 2 doors down is the county. So we're right on the edge of the city. So, but if you live in an environment where you do have a lot of external noise, a lot of traffic, a lot of hustle and bustle of a city, and you can't get it quiet, then try and mask the noise, because the body, the brain, while sleeping, can deal with constant, white noise or fan noise. It's that siren, that garbage truck banging the bins around, those kind of dogs barking that can interrupt our sleep and pull us out. So if you can't get your environment quiet, then try and mask any potential noises. I personally sleep a lot better with moving air over me. So I sleep with a fan pointing at my face. And my wife and I fight because she hates it and I love it. And if it was up to me, I would have it on maximum and be blown out of the side of the bed. So it's on medium. So I still have a marriage. And cold. Turn that thermostat down around 65 degrees if possible. If you live in a part of the country that allows you to be that cool at night. But being cool at night is not just about keeping asleep. It's also about signaling your body to get to sleep. We live in such a pampered society now with air conditioning and double glazing and, but we're biologically designed that it getting dark and cold cues our body to release melatonin, which is the onset for sleep. So living in these environments where it's the same light, the same temperature 24/7, our body is missing some of those external environmental cues. So we need to put them back in. So at nighttime, about an hour or two before bed, turn that thermostat down so it starts to get cooler in your house. And that will help with melatonin expression in the body. And then keep it around 65 degrees or lower if you can while you're asleep. If you get cold, put a blanket on as opposed to turning up the thermostat. But so cool, dark, quiet. They're the kind of the three main ones. Mm-hmm. And then if you're still having issues, look at some breathing exercises, some box breathing, some belly breaths, the stuff that Wendy can teach you in one of her yoga classes, no doubt.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a really good book out there. It's really short, easy read, and you can even skip the first half of it. It's called Say Goodnight to Insomnia. It's written by a Harvard MD. I have no financial stake in this book. Never even met the author. The first half of the book is a little preachy on why pharmaceutical intervention doesn't work effectively. Most people who take Ambien or those types of things, it will usually end up acting as a placebo. They'll fall asleep before the active ingredient can even, have a chance to work. But the second half of the book really gives you really practical advice on how to switch off the brain and how to recenter and so on. So it's a really nice resource for people.
Great. Thank you for that. I will make sure to include the link to that book in the show notes, and also the book that you referred to in the very beginning, that I believe Brian Vila is the author.
Tired Cops?
Yes.
Yeah,
Although
it's a tough one to get hold of.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
And it used to be printed by, I think it was PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum. I think they used to print and distribute it. I'll follow up with you about how to get it. And the data was collected, I guess a couple of decades now, but the core function of policing is still very much the same, and we are certainly still the same biological creature. So although it's a little old, it's still very valid today. It still has a lot to teach us.
Yeah, great. And one thing that I mentioned before, but I really want to make sure that we touch on this, is just the implications of shift work and not getting enough sleep on our metabolism, immune system, long-term disease.
So a paper that I'm willing to share to anyone, and it acts in two ways. One, you can read it and maybe understand how circadian rhythm or circadian desynchrony affects our health. And two, it'll put you to sleep. So, so we are at the core diurnal animals. Like, we are designed to be awake during the day and sleep at night. And anything we do counter to that comes at a cost, either performance, safety, or health. So this paper breaks out into four main risk areas that anyone working shift, but especially people in the protective service and law enforcement, suffer from. They are cardiovascular risks, metabolic risks, increased cancer risks, and behavioral or mental health issues. And in the paper, we try and step through in each of these four areas what's going on at that core biological level when we're working at night, sleeping during the day, and in what we would call a circadian desynchrony, right? Our body is designed to sleep at night. If we sleep during the day, there are internal processes that are guided by our body clocks, our circadian master clocks, that they don't care that you're a night shift worker. You're a diurnal animal. And so if we take, for example, our hunger and appetite hormones, right, or leptin and ghrelin being the two predominant hormones that control how we eat. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. And I remember it by the gruh in ghrelin being like my stomach growling. That is produced, and it's produced in the body as we're awake. So the longer we're awake, the more it's produced. So basically, it's the body's way of saying, you're using this machine, you got to put fuel in it. So the problem is that the hormone that says, hey, you've had enough to eat, you're satisfied, your satiety hormone, leptin, is slave to our master clock, right? Our circadian rhythms, and it's most effectively produced during daylight hours. Our hunger hormone doesn't care about that. So it's when you're awake, you're hungry, feed me, feed me, feed me. But the hormone that says you've had enough isn't being produced effectively if you are working and eating at nighttime. So this is one of those imbalances that we see at that core biological level. That then translates into much greater rates of metabolic disorder, obesity, and type 2 diabetes in shift workers. When we combine that with, unless you are well prepared and you're packing healthy snacks for your shift, your mid-shift snack or pre-shift, what's available to eat out there at 2 a.m. or whenever you get hungry. It's not Whole Foods. They ain't open at 2
Mhm.
a.m. It's McDonald's drive-through. It's whatever. So you have this hunger hormone that's rampaging through your body, and there's no way to keep it quiet. You've got the availability of really bad food, right? That is high in sodium, high in fat, high in carbohydrates, not the good fats either. So that's not helpful. Um, so we see a significant amount of weight gain and metabolic disorder in shift workers, and especially we used to do a presentation where we had a photograph of an NYPD officer leaning over a barricade, and he's got to be like 300 pound, and we always were very careful. We always said we don't put this photograph in the presentation to denigrate the officer, right? He didn't get through NYPD's academy looking like that, right? He was in good shape. We use the photograph to say that if you don't take risks of shift work seriously, and if you don't be mindful of the effects of shift work, especially on your metabolic health, this can be the consequences if you leave it go unchecked. A good friend and colleague of mine, Siobhan Banks, she's a Ph.D, a sleep researcher in Australia. I think she's at the University of South Australia. She works in the area of sleep and diet and the effects of circadian misalignment on our health and wellness. And she works predominantly with bush firefighters, who are kind of working nonstop during the fire season. And there's some efficacy for fasting while on shift. So prior to your shift, graveyard shift now, eating a good meal, not eating at all throughout your shift, and having a good meal before you go to bed. I think Siobhan's a great researcher. I would be hesitant to recommend that just yet until we can understand how the lack of nutrition and not hydration. She doesn't advocate for, we need to all hydrate more. I know very few people who drink enough water. Until we understand what the effect it would have on cognition, right? Because a police officer working graveyard shift is already on the back foot when it comes to sleep and making good choices. If we're also adding in a lack of nutrition and how that might affect their cognitive ability, I don't think we know that yet. But I would say that if you are going to eat during a graveyard shift, make sure it's healthy, right? Make sure it's low fat, high protein, high good fat, I should say, avocado type, and so on. So just be mindful of what you eat.
And I was glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think you and I talked about that. I think you even sent me that article about intermittent fasting, because that's something that I personally practice, and I know a lot of the people that I work with right now it's kind of the buzzword. But I don't know if people truly understand the benefits of why it works. But in addition, combining that with people who work at night, because really with intermittent fasting, it's meal spacing and it's not eating after a certain time. But like you said, if you're up at night and you're not supposed to eat at night, is that contradictory? So
Right.
what do you recommend if you were to recommend this to somebody right now, maybe eating your larger meal if you work a third shift, which let's just say is like 10 to 6? What
Right.
would you recommend?
I would recommend eating it as late as you can to allow that to fuel you through the shift, and really having a really sparse mid-shift meal, and then eating prior to sleep again.
Okay.
Yeah, I know a lot of, especially the guys that I work with and gals in the state of Oregon, in their statewide police academy in the D building, in the defensive tactics building. Like every single one of them is intermittent fasting. Like that, it is absolutely the buzzword, especially in the defensive tactics club. So I honestly don't know enough about the science of why and how it works. I'm just mindful of nutrition can affect cognition, and fatigue affects cognition. And I would just say we need more research to know how the two combine with each other.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know much about it. The little I do know, my understanding is that meal spacing so that your body isn't working as hard to digest as frequently throughout the day is one idea behind it. And also, if you give yourself enough time without food, then your body is metabolizing fat tissue. And so essentially it's consuming its own fat tissue.
And from what I understand, that has to be more than 24 hours without food before that starts happening. But again, that's not my area of research. But one of the things that would, support the idea of eating little or fasting throughout your shift would be, especially if you're in a high tempo, high crime area and you are engaging your sympathetic more than you probably should. The body can't digest food if you are, and so this is another good, a good reason that you need to practice mindfulness and reset, center that around your meal times too, right? So your body is in this parasympathetic, allowing for the rest and digest. Because if you keep filling your body up with calories and then you're go, and you're always in that parasympathetic, they're not being metabolized efficiently.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Well, I really appreciate you spending this time with us. You have given us a lot of good information. I have about 10 more things that I really wanted to ask you, but I want to respect your time. But really the thing that just kind of stands out with me, and I haven't gotten an opportunity to meet your wife, but I really appreciate the passion and dedication that you have to first responders, military, correctional personnel, because this work is so important. It really is.
Thank you. And for me, it's been great. For many of us who have sort of transitioned out of the military into another line of work, it can be very difficult to have a sense of purpose. Whereas this, I feel like I'm still in some way giving back to those who are still on the front lines.
Well, and that definitely comes across. I can tell that you're passionate about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
What, one last thing, how can people find you? If they're interested in your research or anything that you're doing, what would be the best way for them to do that?
If they want to contact me directly, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to give my email address, or you can put it on in the show notes. But it's stevejames@wsu.edu, and that is Washington State University, not Wichita State. But yeah, so just stevejames@wsu.edu, or you can visit my lab website, which is labs.wsu.edu/SHOT, SHOT, and that stands for Simulated Hazardous Operational Tasks. So.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again. And I appreciate you spending some time with us today.
No worries. All right. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Check out the show notes for links mentioned in my conversation with Dr. James, the sleep doctor.